Hi guys, and welcome to absorption of materials. Okay, so this carries on what we've just been learning about the transport and animal systems. So we've learned about how blood moves around the body, and now we're going to learn about how it gets some of the substances which it carries. So in this first part, we're going to look at the lungs. In the lungs, there's an efficient system for exchanging materials. You need to be able to name the structure in the lungs where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged and describe three features of this structure which make it efficient at this job, as well as explaining why the structure makes it efficient. Okay, so let's look at the overview. Oxygen and nutrients from our food must be absorbed into our bloodstream. Things like glucose and oxygen have to be delivered to every cell in our body so that the glucose can be broken down to make energy, and that process called respiration. When oxygen is present, then aerobic respiration can happen and we get many more ATP, so a lot more energy. Aerobic respiration creates a waste product called carbon dioxide. Now that gas can actually harm us, so it's important that we remove it from the cells and get it out of the body. And the way that works is the blood carries it back to the lungs and it moves from the blood into the lungs and is breathed out of the body. So air going in, carbon dioxide coming back out. So we're going to focus on the lungs first of all, and then we're going to go and look at the food in the small intestine. Okay, there's a lot of similarities between these two areas, and in both of them, when it involves the blood, it's not arteries because the walls are too thick. It's not veins because the walls are still too thick, but it's capillaries, the smallest blood vessel that have very thin walls. These are designed to allow the exchange of materials. Okay, so our lungs. When we breathe in, the air moves down the central trachea and splits to the left or right bronchi to fill up either lung. The air keeps travelling down to these little smaller tubes called bronchioles until it reaches these small air sacs which inflate. Now that air sac is called an alveoli. Okay, so the alveoli fills with air. In that air, there's a high concentration of oxygen. So the oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood. At the same time, the blood has a high concentration of CO2. So the CO2 diffuses from the blood into the lungs. Okay, and that's happening every time we breathe in and out. So you should be able to pause the video now and see if you can remember back to science in S1, S2. You should be able to label number 1, that main tube that comes down, number 3, where it splits, number 5, the smallest tubes, and number sac, the names of the fancy name for the air sac. Okay, so this shows the lungs, and the one on the left lung, which again looks at the right on the screen, so this one over here, the ribs have been cut away, and we can start to see all these little dots inside of it. That's the air sacs. And if we zoom in, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 air sacs here, and they're covered by this capillary network. The blood arriving is coming from the heart, okay? So it's deoxygenated blood. So you should be able to tell me what blood vessel it's coming from. It's away from the heart, so it makes it an artery, and it's through the lungs, so this is the pulmonary artery. This deoxygenated blood is high in CO2, so the CO2 moves into the lungs. At the same time, the oxygen from the lungs enters the blood, making it oxygenated, and it goes back to the heart and the pulmonary vein because it's going towards the heart, okay? And that's what we're seeing here. Every breath inflates the lungs, and while that air is there, there's the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and the air is breathed back out. So the air coming in is high concentration of oxygen, the air breathing out is a high concentration of CO2. If you hold your breath, the cells in your body start to run out of oxygen, and the CO2 levels inside the lungs build up, because as the respiration still happens at first, there's more CO2 arriving in the blood at the lungs, and as long as you hold your breath, it stays there until you breathe it out. Okay? So you should be able to label this diagram. These are the alveoli. If you're drawing this inside the capillary, you should write the CO2. That's a high concentration, so the arrow would be this way. So CO2 moves from the blood through the wall of the capillary, through the wall of the alveoli, and into the alveoli. O2 moves the other way. Oxygen here moves into the blood. So oxygen travels through the wall of the alveoli, through the wall of the capillary, enters the blood where it's absorbed by red blood cells because it joins to hemoglobin. So there's three features of the alveoli that you need to memorise. One, there are thousands and thousands of alveoli. If you cut them all open and lay them out in front of you in your own lungs, you would cover a tennis court. Okay? That's how much surface area you have in your lungs. So the more alveoli you have, the larger the surface area, the more efficient you can exchange materials. Alveoli have thin walls. As we just said, that's to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse through the wall. They also have an extensive blood supply, and that's in the capillaries, to carry CO2 to the alveoli and oxygen away from the alveoli. So three features to memorise, please. We can see that here in action. You can see that the blue molecules are coming into the lungs and then passing through the wall of the alveoli, passing into the blood, and they're being picked up by those red squares. You should be able to tell me what the red squares are, and you should be able to name what gas the blue dots are. Because of the direction of movement from the lungs into the blood, the blue dots must be oxygen, making those red squares red blood cells containing hemoglobin, which binds to the oxygen, forming oxyhemoglobin. And that's what we're seeing here. So you have this diagram in your notes, and you need to know these three features: the name of the feature and why it helps with the efficiency of the exchange of materials. Okay? Make sure you get the direction of which gas is going which way correct. Now we're adding a bit more information here. The blood's coming from the left. It looks kind of bluish because it's deoxygenated, which means it's coming from the pulmonary artery. It's receiving oxygen, becoming oxygenated and going back to the heart and the pulmonary vein. So the blood here that's arriving, CO2 is leaving the blood, passing through the wall of the alveoli, to the wall of the capillary, because they're both so thin, and into the lungs. O2 is going the opposite direction. So the capillary has a thin wall, the alveoli has a thin wall. They have extensive blood supplies, so this is happening all over the alveoli with that capillary network, and you have thousands of alveoli, creating a large surface area for this to happen in. Okay, let's look at the digestive system then. Food's broken down by the acids in our stomach, but we're going to look at the absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. Remember, it's small because it's narrower than the large intestine, but it's actually very long. Okay, so you need to know the structure of these things called villi, and you need to be able to explain why they're efficient at absorbing digested materials. Mostly the same features are going to be repeated. However, there are four nutrients being absorbed in the small intestine. 2 go into the capillaries, and 2 go into a new structure called the lacteal. Okay, so you're going to swallow your food, and it's going to move all the way down through the digestive system, broken down in the stomach, and then we're going to absorb food in the small intestine. So our focus here is in the small intestine, and inside the small intestine are these structures called villi. The villi is plural. If it's villus, it's singular. Okay? And they're like small finger-like projections inside the hollow tube of the small intestine. There's a small intestine. So, for example, fat is broken down by the enzyme lipase into fatty acids and glycerol. Both these products have to be absorbed, okay? And that's a job of the small intestine. So inside it's a hollow tube, but the walls are not smooth. They're covered in villi because, you guessed it, that increases the surface area, so more surface to absorb. If you had a condition and you didn't have as many villi, you wouldn't be able to absorb as much food. This is us inside the small intestine now. So where's some food passing down from the stomach? You can see the tube actually squeezes. That's the muscles around it that moves the food along. So that's peristalsis, pushing the food along as it squeezes. But look at the walls. They're not smooth. They're covered in these villi, finger-like projections, which are going to absorb the nutrients from the food. And you can see that wall there close up. Okay, these are the finger-like projections. They're going to absorb the food into the systems so it can be transported around the body to the cells that need it. So many villi create a large surface area, very similar to why you've got many alveoli in the lungs. Again, the wall of the villus, of the villi, are very thin, and that's because digested food has to pass through them. And again, there's an extensive good blood supply to carry the absorbed materials away. So you can pause now and try and answer this question, and then play when you want to know the answer. Okay, so if you've pressed play, hopefully you realise that if you have lots of villi, the less villi you have, the less absorption is going to happen because you've decreased surface area. Okay, so that's a villi under a microscope. Okay, you can see it's a fold, and inside it there's this yellow structure up the middle, and you can guess the red stuff is filled with capillaries because it is red. Okay, so we're going to absorb food into these two structures. Okay, we're going to absorb glucose, so we need that for respiration. We're going to absorb amino acids. All our cells need that to build proteins, and we also absorb fatty acids and glycerol. You don't need to know why. And there is a close-up. Okay, so you can see here the absorption of different chemicals. We're only going to focus on the four I just spoke about on the last page. Every villus is the same, okay? It has a thin wall, only one cell thick. Inside it has a capillary network, blood arriving in arteries, going away in veins, and it also has this yellow structure up the middle by itself, and that's called the lacteal. So the blood carries glucose and amino acids to all our cells. So the glucose and amino acids go straight into the blood. The lacteal, the one that's new to us, carries the ones that we don't know about. So remember it that way around. You should know about glucose and amino acids, and you know lots about the blood. So pair those together in your mind. The lacteal is a new term to learn. So it's the unusual products, fatty acids and glycerol. And you've got to memorise that. Here you can see in action. That peptide has been broken down by enzymes in the small intestine. That's mad, that already. The protein is broken down into amino acids, and because they're amino acids, they're going to be absorbed into the blood. Okay, this exact same thing happens with glucose. If it was a glycerol molecule or a fatty acid, the same thing would happen. It's broken down, it's absorbed, but not into the blood. It would go past this into this yellow structure called the lacteal. Okay, so here's the villi. One's called a villus. If you get a past paper question about a villus, it's singular. So you can't say that it has a large surface area if it's only one. You can only say that if you're talking about villi, which is plural. That's the same in the lungs. If it's an alveolus, you can't talk about large surface area. But if it's the alveoli, many of them, then you can talk about together. They create a large surface area. Pause this and make sure you know it. Okay, so large surface area, quicker absorption. Again, it has a thin wall that allows food to be quickly absorbed. That food is glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol. Again, it has a blood capillary and extensive or good blood supply to efficiently carry away the amino acids and the glucose. And the lacteal absorbs fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, that's us covered transport in plants. You just need to now memorise the structure, the villi, the features of the villi, and be able to explain why each one is able to do its job. Okay? Right. Go and make your notes and good luck memorising this.